Back in the early 90s, my friends Rhett, Josh, and I planned a 3-day camping and fishing trip to a remote area along High Rock Lake. We were all avid fishermen, and we were excited about getting away for a few days to rough it in the woods and try to catch the biggest catfish we could. Having just graduated from high school, this was our first trip away from our home without our parents. So we were both excited and a bit nervous. On a crisp Friday morning in early October, we set out with our backpacks laden with supplies and our spirits high. We packed Rhett's Jeep with our camping gear, grabbed some snacks, and hit the road. The drive to the remote campground was long, and the anticipation of adventure kept us going. Good friends and open roads have a way of making time fly. Upon arriving, we parked the Jeep at the hiking trail entrance and made our way through a trail clearing. We hiked with our gear for about half a mile, found what looked like an old campsite, and set up our tents beneath the canopy of the towering pines. The remnants of a previous campfire, complete with some unburnt firewood, made setting up camp fairly easy, though we were already exhausted from the long trip. As the sun began to set at the edge of the lake, Josh produced some rations from his pack, and we cooked a small but satisfying meal around the warmth of the campfire. The first night passed without incident, and we awoke early as the sun was rising to cook breakfast before setting up our fishing gear along the edge of the water, hoping to catch enough fish for dinner. Our fun adventure would soon take a turn, however, as darkness fell on the second evening and ominous feelings settled over the campsite. I brushed it off as nerves, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The woods grew eerily silent. No sounds of birds, insects, or wind. Only the quiet lapping of the water along the lake bank and the flickering of the campfire could be heard. As we sat around the campfire on the second night, I joked that I felt someone was watching us. Seconds later, Rhett stood up and said, "Do you guys see that?" Quickly, we all stood up to peer across the lake, and sure enough, we saw the silhouettes of what looked like 3 figures standing and looking at us from across the water. It seemed as if they were a mirror image of ourselves. The most unnerving part was that they didn't seem to move at all. The mood of the trip suddenly became very tense. We sat around the fire for the remainder of the evening, speaking in hushed tones, debating whether we should move our campsite or try to just leave altogether. Josh, who seemed the least bothered by it all, urged us that packing up camp and making our way back towards the Jeep in the dark would be the most foolish and dangerous thing we could even consider. So we sat around the campfire all night, unable to muster the nerve to get in our tents and sleep. At some point, however, during the night, I was unable to keep myself awake any longer and dozed off. When I awoke, the campfire was almost completely out. Josh was leaning against a nearby tree, sound asleep, and Rhett was no longer sitting by the fire. A sudden jolt of terror ran through me, and I shook Josh awake. We began to quickly look in each tent and call out in loud whispers for Rhett. He was nowhere to be found. I then saw Josh staring off into the woods, not moving. I came up beside him to get his attention, and then I saw what he was staring at. The figures we had seen earlier across the lake were still standing there, staring back at us. But now they were even closer than before. They were about halfway across the lake, and as the moonlight painted their silhouettes across the cloudy autumn sky, I noticed that there were now 4 shapes staring back across at us, and I could make out the shiny reflections of their glowing eyes. I shook Josh to help him snap out of it, and as he finally looked into my eyes, he said, "They don't look human." We quickly rushed back to the campsite and began to gather our packs. I was willing to risk losing all of my belongings to get the hell out of there. Perhaps I thought we could come back in the daylight, look for Rhett, and gather our stuff if it was still there. Josh spoke up. "We can't just leave Rhett. There's no way we can find him in these woods at night. We need to drive to the nearest town and call for help," I said. Remember, this was in the early 90s, and we didn't have cell phones at the time. We were so far out in the middle of nowhere, they probably would have been useless even today. Just then, we heard rustling in the woods. Something darted to my left through the brush, and both Josh and I hurtled close together, standing by the light of the dying fire. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and started to shine it into the surrounding darkness. Me and Josh were standing back to back, scanning the woods with our flashlights in different directions. I heard Josh mumble, "They're gone." I looked, and sure enough, the shadowy figures were no longer standing on the bank of the lake. "There's no way they got over to us that fast," I said. "It would have taken them at least half an hour to cover that distance." Just as those words left my mouth, I heard a branch snap in the woods close by. I quickly turned and shone my light in that direction, but all I could see was the infinite darkness of the woods. Just then, a loud screaming sound echoed throughout the forest. It seemed to be coming from every direction. The closest sound I could describe it as was multiple people screaming at once. Deep voices, high-pitched voices, all converged together in a hellish shriek, filling the cool night air and our hearts with absolute terror. Without saying a word, Josh darted to the closest tent, and I hesitantly followed behind him. In a panic, he zipped up the tent and began to rock back and forth, hugging himself for comfort. Tears were streaming down both of our faces. I've never felt such fear in my life. My body jerked in uncontrollable nervous jitters, and my lips quivered. Struggling to speak, I said, "We can't just stay here. We're trapped. We have to make a run for the Jeep." Josh looked at me in disbelief. "Rhett has the keys. It's his Jeep." I realized that we were actually in Rhett's tent, and I searched around inside and found his pack, and miraculously found his keys inside. I held them up and showed them to Josh. "We have to run for it. We can do it," I said, as Josh looked at me with blank, tear-filled eyes. Just then, the sides of the tent started to flap and push in. Something was tearing at it, trying to get in. I could hear the sounds of screeching and gnashing teeth as chaos erupted all around us. Josh put his hands up to his ears and began to scream in absolute terror. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything abruptly stopped. We sat there, listening to the silence all around us, until we heard the sounds of breaking branches and rustling leaves darting off into the woods away from the tent. We waited for what felt like an eternity until I finally spoke up. "Now, we have to make a run for it right now," I stammered. Without giving myself time for doubt or hesitation, I grabbed Josh by the hand and unzipped the tent. Not looking, we plunged into the darkness ahead of us for the trail back to the parking lot and the safety of Rhett's Jeep. Panting, exhausted, and so terrified my brain felt like mush, we pushed through the darkness with our tiny flashlights the only thing keeping us sane. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the clearing ahead and moonlight reflecting off the surface of Rhett's Jeep. Just as hope began to fill up within me, I heard that awful, screaming, screeching sound from behind us in the woods. I couldn't help but look back to see how close it was, and I wish I never had. In the distance, about halfway between us and the campsite, I saw 4 figures standing there, watching us. They looked familiar to humans, but something was wrong. They stood hunched over, their shoulders arched up towards their ears, their arms hanging down close to the earth, almost ape-like. Their eyes shone like diamonds cutting through the darkness. Their teethy mouths stretched open into horrible grins. 3 of the faces I didn't recognize. But then my gaze fell on the 4th. It was Rhett. The face of Rhett. Or maybe what used to be Rhett. I'll never be able to forget that grin. It still haunts my nightmares to this day. Somehow, we made it back to the Jeep. Struggling to unlock the door, we got in, locked the doors back, and I spun out of the clearing as fast as I could. As we pulled off, those shiny eyes watched us from the tree line, almost calling us back with their hungry stares. We followed signs to the nearest town, stopped at a local hotel, and first called the police and then our parents. It turned into quite an ordeal. The following days, a search was launched that lasted for weeks looking for our friend Rhett. At one point, they even treated me and Josh like criminals, like we had something to do with his disappearance. But they never found Rhett, his body, or anything else in those woods that got them closer to finding out what exactly happened. Our parents eventually returned to those woods and collected our belongings. During the day, of course. Josh and I refused to go back into those woods, and to this day, I haven't been back in any wooded area since. Years went by, and it's been a long time since I've spoken to Josh, but over the years, I've heard of at least 3 times someone has gone missing near High Rock Lake with mysterious circumstances. I wish I had the courage to go back, find out what happened to us that night, or maybe what those things were. I feel like we owe it to our friend Rhett, but maybe some things are better left forgotten.